We begin our look at the matter of species equality with our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. This is from the Summa Theologica. The background for Thomas Aquinas, which we looked at earlier in part 2, remains the same. Still dead, still a saint. In his writing style, he begins by presenting an objection, and then, which is the view he's going to argue against, and then puts his reply to the objection. And this, of course, reverses the approach in the paper for the course, which is your position on the issue, arguments for your position, objection against it, and then reply. So it's a somewhat different approach. So he first considers the question of, is it, acceptable, lawful to kill living things? Now, Aquinas is, of course, writing in the context of religious thought, but religious philosophical thought, and also in the context of ethics. So he considers this first objection. So it seems unlawful to kill living things. And the question is, why? Well, thou shalt not kill, etc. And to resist the ordinances, the laws of God, purchases damnation, which is basically a way of saying breaking God's rules results in hell. And he claims that divine providence ordains that all living things should be preserved, and so therefore he concludes from this, logically, that it would seem unlawful to take the life of any living thing. And so he's seriously considering that this would be wrong to kill animals. And again, he's writing this around 1270 AD, so this is further evidence that people have been concerned about the killing of animals for quite some time, taking the issue seriously. Then he considers objection 2, essentially a position that he's going to argue against, which is this. Why is murder a sin? His answer is, it's because it deprives a man, a human, of life. But obviously animals and plants are alive, and so it would seem to follow that if what makes murder a sin is killing, depriving one of life, and animals and plants are alive, then it would seem to perhaps follow that it is a sin to kill animals and plants. And so again, he's presenting a pretty good case as to why killing plants and animals is a sin. It's also interesting to hear that he brings up not just animals, but plants. Then he brings up objection 3, a third argument in favor of the position that it is wrong against Christianity to kill animals, and in objection 2, even plants. So objection 3 is this. In divine law, there's only special punishments for sin, and divine law inflicts a special punishment on a person who has killed another's animal, their ox or their sheep. Therefore, he infers killing animals, dumb animals, as he says, is a sin. So that's the arguments he's presenting that he's going to argue against. Now, what he presents, and one reason, good question is, why it's important to consider these old arguments? One is, of course, it's philosophically interesting to consider these arguments, also religiously interesting, from a theological standpoint to consider the arguments. But also, when you look at his replies, you'll probably, if you've ever heard people argue why it's okay to eat meat, or even plants, you'll probably have heard these arguments. So they're still relevant today because people still use them. Now, he looks at our good dead friend, St. Augustine, and references St. Augustine in his reply. So we have to also look at our good dead friend, St. Augustine. So we get kind of a BOGO here. We get both Augustine, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas. So Augustine also addresses this question. Is killing animals okay? And Augustine notes that, as obviously the Bible says on some translations, thou shalt not kill. And so it would seem we shouldn't be killing plants or animals. Augustine's response is this. He claims that it doesn't refer to trees, and presumably other plants as well, because according to him, they have no sense. And this would be somewhat of an empirical question. I guess it would follow that if they did have sense, then it could be a sin. And there are, obviously Augustine wouldn't be aware of this, but today there's some interesting research that purports to show that trees perhaps do have sense, but an interesting empirical question. He also asserts that this the thou shalt not kill, does not apply to what he calls irrational animals, because according to him, they have no fellowship with us. And this, of course, ties into kind of an empirical question. Are all non-human animals irrational? Do they have no fellowship with us? And so what he infers from this, because again, on his view, plants don't count because they have no sense. Irrational animals don't count because they're irrational and have no fellowship with us. And so he says, thou shalt not kill only applies to men, or broader humans. So how does he justify this? Well, Augustine, in addition to being a religious thinker, also a philosophical thinker. So he's going to argue his points. Now, this argument from St. Augustine is, even though it's quite philosophical, involves metaphysics, etc., what we'll see is that it's the sort of argument we see in a much sort of cut down, popular version today. I've heard it myself, and I've heard people, non-philosophers, like at a barbecue or something, arguing about whether it's okay to eat meat or not. So he references back in many respects to our good dead friend Aristotle. So according to Augustine, there's no sin in using a thing for its purpose. This goes back to Aristotle's view that all things have a function, have an end. And following thinkers like Aristotle, he asserts that in the order of things, the hierarchy, the metaphysical hierarchy of the world, the lesser, the imperfect, are for the perfect. Roughly put, in a more general sense, lesser things are for the greater things. And he makes a comparison, of course, a bit of analogy, because philosophers really like analogies. He looks at the process of generation, basically, birth. So he claims that nature proceeds from imperfection to perfection. Presumably not like literally perfect, but going from inferior to superior. And in the case of humans, he makes an interesting claim that in the generation of us humans, there is first a living thing, then an animal, and then at last a human. So he has this interesting view that humans, no, he's not saying like, people, are literally like wild animals and they transform kind of in reverse werewolf into human. But the idea is that the first entity, when you have conception, would be a living thing. It would grow to the point when it's not yet a human, maybe an animal, and then lastly become, human. And so infers, because of this metaphysics, this hierarchy of metaphysics, the lesser existing for the greater, he reasons that plants, they're merely alive. So they exist for the things above them, which would be animals, which can eat them. So that's why it's okay for animals to eat plants. And then in the case of us humans, we're above animals and plants, so we can eat animals, and we can also, of course, eat plants. So infers that, following, Aristotle, explicitly describes him or names him as the philosopher, but such was Aristotle's influence during the time period Augustine was doing his stuff, he was referred to as the philosopher. And so it's okay for us to use plants for the good of animals, animals for our good, because we're better than them. At least according to Augustine. So, in the case of, plants and animals, they're inferior, so we can eat them. Again, this is something, if you've heard, debates today or disputes about whether it's okay to eat animals or not, people often advance the superiority argument. We're superior to cows, so we can eat them. And of course, this is not a concern Augustine raises, but an obvious moral concern is that when you reason from we're better than them, we can do terrible things to them, people, of course, apply that also to people, which raises, a point of concern, because if we're going to accept the supposed better can, do terrible things to the inferior, this is often used to justify doing terrible things to people. He then closes with a look at essentially like a religious argument from authority for why it's okay. And he claims that the necessary use is that animals consume plants as food. We have to use animals for food. And of course, this requires the deprivation of life. And so this is kind of bringing in very quickly the food argument. You need to eat them, so it's okay. And so this would be thus lawful. Then he goes to the explicitly religious argument, basically the divine command, essentially, this God says so, so it's okay. And he references Genesis. The particular quotes being, "Behold, I have given you every herb and all trees to be your meat, and to all beasts of the earth." So basically, God says, okay. And in Genesis also says, "Everything that moveth and liveth shall be meat to you." So the idea basically is God gives his permission. So his essential arguments are, we're better than them, so we can eat animals. Animals are better than plants, so they can eat plants. And also, you got to eat something, and this requires, depriving them of life, so it's okay. And also, God has commanded it, so it's okay. And those are Augustine's main arguments. We now turn to Aquinas' replies. So his first reply to objection, the first objection is referencing Augustine. So he asserts essentially that in the case of animals and plants, their law is not about the animals and plants for themselves, but for us humans. And he references Augustine, which we've already looked at, and so that's his first reply. Basically, Augustine refutes this. His second reply to his second objection is this. Much like what Augustine said, he asserts that animals and plants lack the reason to set themselves in motion, which is a philosophical way of saying that animals and plants lack intelligence. And so what is it that moves them? Well, he says they're moved by something else, a natural impulse. And this is stealing or borrowing from Aristotle, the idea that rational beings like humans were self-directing, at least in some regards, but then other entities are not directed by themselves, they're directed by something else. For Aristotle, of course, God's not involved in this. For Aquinas, it is a natural impulse, which of course traces back to God. So from this he infers that since they lack reason, he infers they're naturally enslaved and exist for the use of others. Again, this essentially is the argument that they're inferior to us, therefore it's okay for us to use them. Now again, this argument is appealing to many people, and in many cases I've heard, again, not for other philosophers, but just like in non-philosophical settings like a barbecue or a restaurant, when you have someone who's against eating meat, the vegetarian or vegan, and they bring that up about the animals, and someone will pretty much always bring up this reply, which is that animals are inferior, so it's okay to eat them. So this is still a thing today, which is why it's still relevant. As I noted before, one of the concerns of this, of course, is if we seriously take the principle what is inferior can be, used by someone else, by superior things. We've seen that people have taken the view that they're superior to other people and then use that to justify treating people terribly. His final reply is to the argument, that, well, it's a sin when someone has harmed or killed, an ox that belongs to someone else. And his reply back here is, yeah, it's a sin, but it's not a sin against the ox or the animal. It is basically a property crime, that the harm done is not done to the ox, but by injuring a person in their property. So this is not a sin of murder, but it's a sin of theft or robbery, depriving someone of their rightful property. So essentially, what Augustine and Aquinas present, because Aquinas presents Augustine's argument, are arguments that are, first, the gist of the main reply is animals and plants are inferior to us, so we can eat them. Plants are inferior to animals, so they can eat them as well. So the superior can consume the inferior. This would obviously entail that God could eat everybody, but hopefully it won't do that. Then the second part, essentially that reply is, there's also, of course, the religious reply. God says it's okay. And then lastly, in terms of the sin, for killing the animals, it's a property crime. And of course, this is something that can be debated and discussed. But for now, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.